What is up, theology nerds? This is Trip. And today on the podcast, we have a professor of communication studies, the director of the Institute for Global Engagement at the State University of New York, Ulises Mejias. And I got turned on to his work by a student. That's right. I was teaching a class on AI and religion, and it brought up in the middle of it just how difficult it is to tackle this subject theologically, because so much of the literature that engages like AI, religion, our relationship to technology is thinking about traditional theological concepts, like what does it mean to be human, the nature of community, these kinds of things, but not many of them spend significant amount of time thinking of how the technology itself is reoriented power in a dramatic way. And so if we're wanting to look for liberation, if we're wanting to build solidarity, then there's both this task of understanding, right, our drive call, an invitation to be a part of God's flourishing and justice. Yes, okay. Almost every Christian theologian worth their salt is going to do that. But if we don't know what we're up against, if we don't recognize how the terrain has changed, how the web of relations between humanity, our economic system, the nation state and power, has it been rearranged under the rise of digital technology and algorithms in such a way that what we're up against is different. So even the drive for solidarity, even the dream of liberation takes different forms based on our contemporary context. And I was talking about that there. I even had conversations with Gord Rieger recently in our class looking at global liberation theologies about this. And a student said, hey, you got to check out Ulises. And whoop, 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 turns into deep dive trip reads, all sorts of things, watching his lectures on the internet, and then email him and boom, he said yes. So we're going to have a conversation together about really the emergence of a new form of colonialism based in data and technology. It is kind of a initially shocking thing to say, but I hopefully asked good enough questions for Ulises to lay it out, because it just blew my mind when I was reading this kind of stuff in the book. And then at the end, after kind of looking at this kind of colonial framing of what's going on technologically, we talk about some kind of more specific challenges, how it's being used and implemented, say in immigration enforcement, and what does it look like in the classroom? Like, how is AI, what do we do with it in a classroom? How does it relate to our research? Are we problematizing and doing theft and all these kinds of things in the way it's being used? It was an amazing conversation. So I just want you all to know it is always a joy. One, getting to move outside of like the normal disciplines I engage in, but when you email someone whose books kind of blew your mind and say, I really want to talk to you because I know a whole lot of people of faith with deep progressive commitments because God cares and is invested in organizing our material reality for greater flourishing and justice. And I don't know how many theologians and faith leaders have thought about how the data grab of big tech is transforming the conditions in which we build community and work towards justice. And he's like, look, I kind of like liberation theology and would love to do this. So boom shakalaka, come on. Anyway, here's Ulises. I'll put links to some of his talks and books and everything in the post. But what a treat! If you enjoy it 1/3 as much as me, then you're gonna have a great day. You're gonna have a great day. As people of faith, the words of the Bible are sacred. But sometimes, if we're being honest, the Bible, especially the Old Testament, is more confusing than clear. The contradictions and complexities in the text leave us shaking our head and with more questions than answers. In Sacred Tension, Embracing Dissonance and Dialogue in the Old Testament, popular biblical scholar Bill Brown suggests that the diversity of the Bible is in fact one of its greatest strengths, pointing us toward more Bible, not less. He invites us to read the Old Testament as a wide-ranging dialogue that's in conversation both with itself and with us, fostering further discussion and mutual discernment. With passion and expert insight, Brown takes us on an enlivening journey through the Bible, exploring dissonance and complexity anew. Let the conversations begin. Get 20% off Sacred Tensions with the promo code HBCST at store.upperroom.org. Yeah, just drop that code HBCST at store.upperroom.org. Well, hello, everyone. This is Trip, and today, Ulises' first trip on the podcast, and we are going to talk about AI, data colonialism, and how a student pointed out that he has done work on my complaint in the middle of the AI and religion class that we need to think about how our current technologies are reshaping our relationships and structuring our desires if we want to think about a deeper solidarity to resist patterns of oppression. And it's always good when a student turns into a research assistant. And then the author says yes to talking to you. So thank you so much for being here.
You're very welcome. It's a pleasure to join this podcast. So I'm really looking forward to our conversation.
So I think a place to begin would be for you to tell us the origin story of when the kind of work you've done in thinking about decolonization and the way colonialism has played out historically. Like, when did all of that kind of reflection connect with what you saw going on in technology and data to kind of like birth a decolonizing reflection around technology?
Yeah. Well, that's a great question. Origin stories are always fun. So I should start by saying that what we have come to know as the decolonial turn in data studies has been going on for a few years. And my co-author and I, Nick Coultry, he's a professor at the London School of Economics. We've written a couple of books, a few articles. We have been working on this subject for almost a decade now. And so, hopefully, as we sort of talk about this topic, your listeners will get a sense that this is a growing field, that there's lots of people involved. Lots of names come to mind, particularly another collaborator of ours, Paula Ricarte from Mexico City. Lots of people in the global south who are interested in these issues. But for me personally, I am originally from Mexico. I'm from Mexico City. I grew up there. By now, I've spent more time in the United States. I came here to study and ended up staying for work. But obviously, growing up in Mexico, as you can imagine, shaped my sensibilities, my cultural understanding in deep ways, in profound ways. And so, one of those ways is I've always been interested in colonialism, how, yes, the experience of colonialism shaped my culture and my country. I love going to downtown Mexico City. I don't know if you've ever been trip, but it's an amazing place in the sense that what we call the Zócalo, you can see underground the pyramids of the Aztecs, basically. And above ground, you can see the colonial palaces and government buildings that the Spaniards built on top of the pyramids to sort of, signal that this order is now over and here's the new world order, and the new, yes, political and religious perspectives that were to govern the so-called New World. So anyway, I've always been interested in these issues. So as part of that, about a decade ago, I was reading something called the Requerimiento. I don't know if you've heard of this document. So basically, it's a document that Spanish conquistadors would read as they were about to colonize a village or a city in the so-called New World. Sometimes they would arrive in the middle of the night under cover of darkness, and they would stand outside of the city limits and proceed to read this very interesting document in Spanish to people who did not speak Spanish. And you can Google it, you can go to Wikipedia and read the requerimiento, but it's an amazing document. Basically, it says, here we are. Everything that belongs to you now belongs to us. In the name of the Pope, in the name of the Your Highnesses, Kings of Spain. Basically, your life as you know it is over. What you have now belongs to us. If you do not submit, we can declare war, we can kill you, we can take away your wives and your children and your property. And so, thank you for listening. Now, when I read that, I was amazed because the first thing that came to mind is this sounds a lot like the terms of service agreements that we read today. It's like it's all this weird language that we don't understand. That's why the analogy to the requerimiento happened, right? It's like people were being read this thing in Spanish and I had no idea what it meant. And so I started to think about like, well, there's this terms of agreement that we say, yes, I click a box that says, yes, I agree, I consent, but we have no idea of what those documents are saying. We don't understand them. They're in some abstract legal language that we have no way of comprehending. But it's a very important mechanism that basically starts this act of dispossession that basically says, yes, I'm okay with you, corporation, doing whatever you want to do with my data. And so, you know, I get to have access to all of these tools, quote, for free, unquote. And so in exchange, here's my data, do with it what you want. So speaking of origin stories, if you wanted a very specific moment in time where all of this started for me was precisely that, juxtaposing these two documents, the requerimiento and the terms of service, and thinking how little things have changed in
Mhm.
terms of, using this deception, this abstract language. Of course, what happened after I installed Google Chrome is very different to what happened after the requerimiento was read. But still, the use of this language to start this process of dispossession, that was very interesting.
Mhm. No, I think that analogy is extremely helpful. It shows how both of them use this kind of real intentional miscommunication or lack of communication to appropriate resources on the terms of the one that is showing up, right? And if you think back to a context where in the colonial past, where it's not till later after violence and responses happened that they could point back and like legitimate themselves by having read something in another language. There's kind of been a growing number of moments where the clicking on terms of conditions, which in many ways are required for your job or to engage on social networking platforms and all these spaces. I think people are kind of just now becoming conscious of what was given up in these seeming like moments of confusion that some lawyer said they need to do this so we can finally look at pictures of our grandkids.
Yeah.
And so one of the things that I really appreciated about the book was was following that line and starting to describe data as data territories. As you've introduced that kind of language to think about this, are there particular features of it that have helped people kind of connect those dots more easily, or kind of common questions or pushbacks that if you address them, people start to see at least the proposal you're making, even if they aren't sure they want to go there yet?
I mean, firstly, yeah, I should add that the requerimiento was ridiculous even back then. I think people recognize, like you can't be serious. And it was contested and ridiculed even back then. But you're right that at the center of it all is this notion of consent. Can we really consent when we don't understand? Can we consent when we are forced to use something to earn a living, to get through life, etc.? So you're very correct to point that out. So in order to kind of explain all of these issues having to do with consent, with data appropriation, Nick and I have developed this concept of data colonialism and data territories. So let me sort of give a quick overview of what we even mean by that, because I think some people get distracted in a couple of different ways. First, they think we are against data. We're saying data is bad. We're not. We are specifically talking about one way in which data is used, and I will sort of describe that. And of course, the other thing some people have problems with or issues with is like, how dare you refer use the word colonialism in this context? Colonialism is something of the past, something that a genocide, something that was barbaric. So are you suggesting, these people ask us, that simply by using Instagram, perpetrating the same kind of violence? And our response is that no, obviously we're not. Yes, we're using the same word, colonialism. We're not using it metaphorically. We're not saying this looks like colonialism. This feels like colonialism. We are saying this is, in fact, a new stage of colonialism. Colonialism and capitalism keep evolving, keep developing, and this is the latest stage of that. So, when we say that we're not against data and that we're specifically talking about one particular thing that's happening today, is that, what we define as data colonialism, we're saying that it's basically an emerging social order for the appropriation of data so that it can be continuously extracted from our daily lives for one purpose and one purpose only, and that is to generate profit, to generate wealth for an elite, basically. So again, we're not saying all data is bad. I checked the weather this morning and that was using data in some ways. Data can have very positive, very useful uses. So we're specifically talking about the appropriation of data from human life for the explicit purpose of generating wealth. So another good way to think about it is that whereas the original historic colonialism was about appropriating land, data colonialism is about appropriating human life. Now, there are many differences. Colonialism, obviously, we have 500-year history. Uh, there are many differences between the colonialism that we experience in Mexico versus what was experienced in India versus what, according to some, might be experienced right now in Puerto Rico or in Gaza. All of those forms of colonialism are very different, but they all have one similarity, which they also share with data colonialism. And that similarity is to the function, which is to extract, to dispossess. So that's why we're saying this data colonialism is a form of extraction of human life, for the generation of profit, of wealth, which creates new forms of inequality. So, in many ways, this new form of colonialism extends the legacy of previous forms of colonialism, the legacy of racism, the legacy of economic underdevelopment, yeah, the legacy of oppression, of sexism, and so on. So, these data territories that you mentioned, basically, instead of colonies, we have this data territory. The data territory is essentially our life, our human life, but data territories are also bounded spaces. You don't need territories, a colony called Mexico that you're going to establish as a territory. Now you need a territory that basically you can create through computer code. So platforms are territories, Instagram, etc., Google search engines. Territories can be the Internet of Things, all sorts of smart devices, from our cars to our televisions to our toaster ovens, that are connected to the internet and that capture our data again and set all of that data to a company for the generation of wealth. Data territories sometimes are a little bit more invisible. We have like educational technology, health technology, property technology, war technology, all of these areas where technology and data specifically is sort of changing the way we live on a day-to-day basis. So that's sort of what we mean by a data territory. It's a new creation, it's a new form of bounded space that is controlled through computer code, and it's created so as to facilitate the extraction of data from our daily lives.
For people that might not have thought about it in this lens, could you kind of describe just the kind of data the average citizen generates and just what it's contributing to to the different platforms or industries that have access to it?
Sure. Well, let's I can give lots of examples. Let's start with our cars, automobiles, because until very recently, those were just pretty simple, quote unquote, machines, internal combustion engine, certain safety mechanisms, and we can use them to get from point A to point B. Now, of course, cars are computers on wheels. They have lots of digital components, and as of a couple of years to now, they have become basically data territories to capture all of this data. So when we get into a car, basically, if it has a screen, it means it's recording lots of information about us. Is our seatbelt on? What speed are we going? Where are we going? Location. How fast? Are we applying the brakes? What are we listening to in the radio? What media entertainment content are we accessing? What is the temperature of the cabin? All of this is data that is captured by the car and sent to the car manufacturer. This company then can resell this data to advertisers, to insurance companies, to whoever wants it. Maybe an insurance company is interested and Trip knowing whether your car, is what it's been recording your speed. And so we have a history of you. Apparently, you like to go over the speed limit. So maybe we should adjust your insurance rate a little bit to compensate for that fact. Or maybe advertisers are interested that, you seem to stop at Starbucks every morning at 8 o'clock. So maybe next time you log into Instagram, we can show you a coupon, an ad for Starbucks, so that you're encouraged to spend even more money there. Likewise, we could talk. I mean, I think it's kind of obvious to talk about what happens on platforms like Instagram or TikTok, right? I mean, where all of the data of what we watch, when we watch it, who we shared with, all of that is data that is collected and shared in the same ways that I just described with our car data. Our health data I mentioned earlier, not just what gets generated in terms of when we go to the doctor's office, but let's assume that you have a Fitbit or an Apple Watch, and it's constantly recording your heart rate and your sleep habit patterns and your blood pressure and so on and so forth. Again, all of this is data that maybe is of interest to insurance companies. Maybe it's of interest to advertisers. I think we're living in a world where whoever can get access to all of these data sets, to all of these databases, and make interesting correlations between the data, that translates into a lot of power. We're seeing that today unfolding right now with what is happening in our government and what is happening with Doge. Many people are calling that a data coup. The fact that a private individual, Elon Musk, has basically gotten the password to some of the government's most important databases. And who the hell knows what he's doing there? I mean, supposedly he's going in there and his cadre of, young computer hackers, they're going in there to find ways to maximize efficiencies, to cut unnecessary costs, etc. While they're doing that, I imagine that they're making copies of all of this data and now they have access to very important data. Let me sort of mention one other area, which maybe we can discuss in more detail. But for instance, border control, immigration control has become very data centric. And so, again, agencies that are in charge of controlling borders and in this day and age of identifying illegal migrants and deporting them, they rely on a lot of this data. In many cases, they don't have the resources to collect all of this data. So what do? They go and buy it from the kinds of data brokers that we were just talking about. So border control also wants access to your car data and your location data. Border control wants access to your financial data. They want access to your educational data. Yes, they want access to your social media data to see if you've been posting something on social media that might give an indication of your activities or of your social circles to see if you socialize with other migrants who may or may not be illegal. So again, I think, our daily lives have become about the capture and the use of all of this data. And basically, data is power. It's not just great for business. Think of all of the companies that are having contracts with the government, to develop all of the systems to capture all of this data. So it's a really profitable enterprise, but it's also a really good way to exercise control over the population.
Yeah, one of the things that I found really helpful in your work is connecting the fact that this kind of transformation of our social spaces into data territories, it isn't an accident. It wasn't the only option or path that could have been taken through the development of the internet and smartphones and this kind of thing. And it's the nature of the path we've been on that you're trying to lift up and problematize. And one of the frameworks that you've developed is the 4X model to look at the way it explore, expand, exploit, and exterminate. I'd love for you to kind of outline that and how those kind of moments or kind of like maneuvers of power in kind of older forms of colonialism have been kind of transformed into the current moment.
Sure, yes. And actually, it's kind of interesting because you know where the 4X model comes from? It comes from strategy video games. So again, that was one of those aha moments, right? Where I was reading about video games and it's like, well, in strategy video games, kind of like Sid Meier's Civilization, you might be familiar with that. There's many others. But the way in which you sort of approach gameplay and the way in which you win is by applying this 4X model: explore, expand, exploit, and exterminate. And actually, there's a video game based on colonialism. It's part of Sid Meier's series. There's Colonialism, the video game. And so you go around this computer world, establishing colonies, pacifying the native populations. And that's how you grow your empire. That's how you grow your world. Explore, expand, exploit, and exterminate. So Nick and I realized, well, this is basically a very handy handbook, playbook for how colonialism operates. And that is, in fact, how colonial enterprises have been operating since 500 years ago. We should also point out, which is very important, that colonialism has always been a partnership between corporations and governments. Of course, the most clear example is the East India Companies, the East India Company, but we can go back. Even the Spanish conquistadors had a Casa de la Contratación de las Indias, a quasi corporation to handle the operations of empire. And so, corporations back then and corporations today, big tech, they follow this playbook. They explore, they set out to find new opportunities, new areas where colonization can happen. In our case is yes, where can I extract more data from? It's like, like you want a new tool to help you write your emails, ChatGPT. Well, how can I use it to also extract data from you and to learn from your interactions with this tool? So exploring basically means, finding new ways, new spaces where that extraction can happen. And in this day and age, basically, data capture happens everywhere. From the moment you wake up and you look at your phone, sometimes actually even while you're sleeping, if a Fitbit is recording your sleep patterns, or if you have a smart home device that keeps, track of the security of your uh, house, of your home, surveillance, all of that. But anyway, from the moment you wake up to, throughout your day, as you go to work, as you go to school, as you interact with families and friends, all of these activities have now become mediated by data extraction machine. So basically, that's the result of all of this exploration of how corporations can extract data. Then, of course, they need to expand it to more and more areas. So, like we said, it's not just enough that you log on to a computer and use it for work. Now, our mobile devices are keeping constant records of where we are, who we interact with. So, it's expanded to basically all of our social lives. And of course, you need to make money from it. So, how can we exploit it? And here in our work, Nick and I talk about cheap data as sort of this notion that replaces cheap nature and cheap labor. We were told, the colonizers, in order to colonize the world, we were told that they saw nature as something cheap. They saw labor as something cheap, something that was abundant, just there for the taking. Now we are being told that we need to look at data the same way. Like, oh, well, look at all of this data. You're generating it throughout your day. It doesn't have any value to you, so let us take it and do something useful with it. Just like colonial resources, oil. Oil didn't mean anything to native populations. So, the narrative is that colonizers had to arrive with their advanced machinery of refineries and turn this resource into something useful because native populations didn't have the knowledge, didn't have the capacity to maximize the use of this resource. Same thing with data. It's like, well, you're generating all of this data when you use your phone, but you're not doing anything useful with it. Give it to us, we will do something useful. And of course, the last X, which is extermination, the system sort of leads us to this final outcome. Now, again, like I said at the beginning of our talk, we're not suggesting there's a one-to-one equation here. We're not suggesting that the genocide of the historic forms of colonialism is being repeated here. But we are saying there's plenty of violence going on. Because if we think about the injustices that are continued through the system, if we think about the fact that, for instance, it's people in the global south that are hired at substandard wages to train AI, to collect all of this data and then teach the machine this is a picture of a cat and this is a picture of a dog, and you should know the difference, AI. So it takes a lot of human work to do that. And so, guess what? That work happens mostly in the global south. Or if we think about the gig economy, we don't need to go to the global south. We can stay here in the global north. And then when I go to a big city and hire an Uber driver, that driver is usually, let's admit it, a person of color, perhaps a new immigrant to this country, someone desperate enough to work for substandard wages. Because at the beginning of the deal, like, oh, Uber sounds great. I'm gonna be the master of my own time, work whenever I want to. And it looks like the wages are decent enough. Because what? As soon as you start working, you can see your wages go down, go lower and lower and lower. Because again, through data, through these algorithms, that's how they set up the system, right? They capture new drivers with decent wages, and then the algorithm works to start to lower those wages to give you fewer and fewer gigs. So that by the end of the day, these platforms, these gig economy platforms are exploiting labor even more so than in regular jobs, where at least many times, hopefully, you have benefits, you have unions that can represent you. In the gig economy, it's like you're on your own because you're not even a worker for these companies, right? You're just a contractor. So no benefits for you, no contracts for you. So that's the way in which extermination continues to play, we argue, a big part in this system.
Oftentimes the framework for even thinking about the our relationship to data is so specific that the kind of ubiquity of data colonialism and data capture doesn't really get addressed. And I think that oftentimes there's this sense, especially among kind of Western middle class people, that that the that until recently they haven't even been really aware of the impact that's taking place just at the social fabric or the transformation of the workspace now for even white collar workers. But one of the things that I found helpful, taking that analogy of colonialism seriously and running it through, is the kind of awareness of the increasing precarity of the middle class has an engine, and it's a colonialist one. And it takes obviously those kinds of observations and awakenings about our reality to generate the kind of solidarity to resist those forms of power. And it's so hard to do it until it's named. And
Right.
I wonder if, in your time presenting this kind of content and interacting with other peers that in the university, or who shows up after reading a book like this at a book gathering or places like, what are the places that perhaps more white collar workers or more middle class people are starting to see the ways in which this new form of colonialism is shaping their lives and the possibilities available to them, their kids, and their grandkids?
Yeah. Yeah. Well, it's fascinating because we have been fortunate enough that our work, has enjoyed some popularity, or many people have become aware of it. In fact, our last book, Data Graph, basically we were approached by Penguin in the UK to essentially take our previous book, The Cost of Connection, which was an academic book, and translate it for a general public. So that's how that happened. And so Data Graph hopefully get to be read by many people. But you're right that I think one of the issues we've faced is, well, firstly, it's true that in the global south, or with certain populations here in the United States, in the global north, in Europe, etc., the message seems to go easier because it's like, oh, colonialism, I know about that. I come from a former colony. So now you're telling me that that model, I can use it and apply it to understand what's happening now. That makes sense. I think we found again and again that for people who basically come from former colonies, this is not an easy pill to swallow because it's still a very difficult message. It's a depressing message in many ways, but at least, they can begin to understand it. They have a tool now to make sense of it. It's also true, on the other hand, that many people in positions of privilege hear this message and say, what are you talking about? I don't feel colonized. I'm using all of these tools and I don't have a problem with it. It sort of reminds me of an opinion I've heard through my many years of teaching. When I present these opinions, many of my students say, I don't care if corporations or the government, they are tracking me. I'm not doing anything wrong. So why should I care if the data is being captured? Now, so we have a couple of responses to that. I mean, firstly, just because you're a beneficiary of the system doesn't mean the system doesn't exist. In many cases, the people who say, I don't have a problem with it is because, truth be told, they get to benefit a little bit from the system. And to go back to the example of my classroom, we've had some very interesting discussions because I have seen that opinion change throughout the years. I think 10, 15 years ago, most of my classes would say, I don't care. If I'm being tracked, I'm not doing anything wrong. Guess what? From 5 years ago to now, more and more of my students are having a problem with that perspective. And they're saying, wait a minute, I do care and I have a problem. And not surprisingly, it's a lot of students who don't have the same kind of privileged positions that are having problems with the way this system is set up. And so then that's great because at least we get to have a conversation about it. And so hopefully the students who benefit from the system can see that just because they are benefiting, the reality might be different for other people. And so, they get to hear and listen to what that reality might look like for others. But you're right that in many ways it's a class issue. And, colonialism, the history of colonialism and the history of capitalism has been one of creating class divisions so that we think, the problem with society is this antagonism between classes when we should actually be looking at, how the system works and who actually gets to benefit. The class of people that actually get to benefit from all of this, we should be talking about them. But I think a couple of things are changing. In terms of the middle class, as you pointed out, I think AI is changing the rules of the game because generally we're used to thinking about, quote, progress, technological progress, end quote, as something that low income people have to pay the price for and that benefits middle class people and obviously the elites. With AI, that is changing very rapidly because AI is coming after the jobs of middle class folks. So if you are a computer programmer, if you have a college education, but you're a graphics designer, or you're an accountant, or you are doing lab work at a science lab, AI is has a very good chance of replacing some of what you get to do. So the middle class is sort of now waking up and saying, "Oh, wait a minute, I'm not sure I like this the way things are headed." And so it's interesting. It's very interesting to see what's happening with ChatGPT and sort of the narratives for its adoption and who gets to resist it. And we can talk about my op-ed that I wrote about sort of what's happening with generative AI in academia, the cheating crisis, the plagiarism crisis. That's something very important to discuss. But I do want to make sure we also understand that while the middle class is now perhaps going to experience some hardships as a result of all of these systems, lower income people continue to pay the heaviest price, and it is a fact. It's not, a dystopian future. It's already a fact, something that we can see today. That if you are a member of low income class here in this country, a lot of the decisions about your daily life are already being determined by AI or by an algorithm. Your access to resources, to social services, whether you get a loan from a bank, what kind of access to certain education opportunities your children will have. All of that is already being determined by a computer. A lot of it is already being determined by a computer. And that's what worries me, that especially with
Yeah.
the current administration, we are entering an era where it's like, oh, yeah, we're going to have an algorithm to determine benefits, to cut
Hmm.
costs, to determine work schedules, to decide which programs survive and which programs are cut by Doge. I think that is in the near future something very scary that we will see because we're already seeing it and it's going to get worse. Using AI
Yeah.
and using algorithms to control the lives of low income people.
Hmm. And that's an element of what you described as algorithmic governance. And maybe you could
Yes.
just kind of unpack that a little bit and how that actually changes the nature of political power and sovereignty.
Yeah. Well, like I mentioned earlier, I'm paying a lot of attention, as I'm sure a lot of us are, to what's happening with Doge in the government, because, yeah, some people are calling it a data coup. And some people are pointing out that not sure how much Musk and others understood. I think they had a pretty good idea. He had a pretty good idea having gone through what he did at Twitter, now known as X. Basically, he's, following that playbook again and applying it to government. And he realizes that, yes, the person with the password to the databases, to the computer systems, has a lot of power. And so the kinds of damage that's being done, it might take decades to fix. But, yeah, and a lot of it is based on disinformation. And that's a whole new, an entire different podcast we could have, just how, information about what's going on gets transmitted not to the traditional channels where we could at least all watch the same news program and get access to biased, yes, but also in some ways reliable information. Whereas today is like, who the hell knows? People learn about a lot of what's happening through social media. And so if Musk tweets one day that the USA aid is bad, then everyone is like, yes, get rid of it. I'm not saying there's not a lot of corruption in US aid and other government agencies. I'm not saying the role that those agencies have played has always been positive, especially when you ask people from my part of the world, where, we can see that a lot of the work of these agencies has, in many instances, been used to repress and oppress people in the global south, but not all of it is bad. And so, like one example I was reading about, USA has this program of manufacturing protein bars, essentially a mixture of peanuts and milk powder that the US can send to areas where there's malnutrition and starvation. And yeah, maybe it comes with a certain political cost, but at the end of the day, who would want children in Africa to die of hunger or to be malnourished? But suddenly, USAID is bad. That's what we hear in social media. And so then Elon Musk is cutting it and is saving us taxpayers billions of dollars, which in truth we know is not billions of dollars because it turns out they haven't been doing the math correctly. So, those benefits, we're still waiting to see if it's actually, saving us any money. But to go back to your question, is like, well, when you control the data, that is at the center of how these programs work. When you control the data, which is at the center of how we learn about what's going on in our government, when you control the data, that basically, is how media is disseminated these days. We're no longer in a broadcast media world, we're in a social media world. And so, who controls, who governs all of these platforms? Yeah, that is a lot of power. And what we're finding is that unfortunately, through decades of work, I'm not just blaming the Republicans and the Trump administration because this situation has been decades in the making, and Democrats have contributed to the making of this situation where corporations have fewer and fewer restrictions, they have more and more power. Government has been deregulating all industries, including the media industry. So it is not surprising that now a handful of oligarchs have control of these media systems and can govern this government and these public and private data systems and can run amok and do whatever they want.
Yeah. You shared two different recent kind of editorial opinion type pieces on really different topics, but both of them I think now that people have an idea of how your larger kind of critical theory it works, you can see how it plays out. And one of them was on AI in education, something that I think all of our peers in a classroom, along with every student and parent, ask questions about on a consistent basis. And oftentimes, much like any ethical question in a world that's so shaped by economic incentives, a question about the use of AI for kind of educators would be like, well, what's most efficient for getting to the goal of being assessed in the right way? And then for a student, it's like, well, I might want to do it one way, but if they're going to do it this way and be assessed in a way they get an advantage, I'm going to use AI just like I'm going to use an accountant later when doing my taxes. And the normal framings for these already get narrowed where this kind of inherent competition exists, but the terms of the relationships and the frameworks for it don't. And that's what I found so helpful about your article is it's simultaneously realist about the situation, but isn't going to jump immediately past the kind of transformation of values in education that AI kind of thrust upon us as a society. So like, when you think of like beginning a conversation around AI in the university context and in research and this kind of thing, what's the how does the big picture help us kind of raise the question differently?
Yeah. Well, I care deeply about education, obviously, as a professor. Uh, my doctoral studies were actually in education and technology. So I believe in the power of, using technology in education. So again, just like um, I'm not saying I'm against data, I'm also not against using technology in education. But generative AI, the use of AI to generate text and music and art and things that usually associate with human creativity, Gen AI has had a disruptive effect on education for the worse. Now, I'm not saying certain things about education needed to be disrupted. I've seen many people say that, well, if ChatGPT has killed the 5 paragraph essay, maybe that's a good thing because, maybe it was a fantasy to believe that the best way to teach students writing is to give them this formula of 5 paragraphs. You cannot deviate from it. And so that's what writing is. And so if ChatGPT has killed that, because now anyone can go and ask ChatGPT to create a 5 paragraph essay on anything and follow that formula, if ChatGPT has killed that, then maybe that's a good thing. If it's getting to question, if it's getting us to question these formulas that we've relied on education that have served students well, maybe that's a good thing. But that's not the only thing that's happening with AI. I mean, I think I'll start sort of at the end of what I say at the end of my op-ed, which is for one thing, Gen AI has completely changed the social relationships with my students in my classroom because it's like walking through a virtual world where I'm not sure if what they've written is really what they've written. I can no longer trust them. And I'm sorry to have to say this, and I know it's not fair to most of my students, but the insertion of this technology, which I didn't ask for, and which my students didn't ask for, has basically eroded that social contract, that trust that used to exist. Whereby if I ask the student to write something, maybe it's badly written, but then I can work with the student on improving it, and at least I can assume it's their own words. I can no longer assume that. So that's created a very sad, depressing, and frustrating scenario. To add to that, as I argue in this op ed, and I'm hoping you can put links to all of this in the show notes.
Yeah,
This
yeah.
is an op ed published by Future You blog. Apart from this issue of social trust, I firmly believe that Gen AI is a plagiarism machine. And what I mean by that is a couple of different things. Firstly, it was created through plagiarism. The way to train Gen AI, ChatGPT and Llama and all of the other models, was by feeding it tons of data points, millions of texts, thousands of images and videos and music recordings. The companies that created these systems did not license that content. The companies that created the system stole that content, used it without permission. They plagiarized it. And then they created a machine that basically, if I go to Wikipedia and I ask for the definition of something, it will find an article and give me that result. If I ask ChatGPT, basically it will take all of this plagiarized content and prepared a plagiarized response, taking a little bit from each one of those and presenting it as something that is true. It's not a word by word plagiarism. But if we look at the different kinds of plagiarism that exist, the different kinds of plagiarism that we have been teaching our students not to do, that's still plagiarism. If you paraphrase something and change a word here and there, but it's still based on something somebody else wrote, it's still plagiarism. So that's all ChatGPT is. It's very sophisticated plagiarism. And so the other point I make is that if we consider ourselves part of institutions of higher learning, where citation is the thing that we respect the most, citation, if I write anything in academia, I need to cite my sources. I need to say, I'm using this idea from so and so. I'm standing on the shoulders of the people who came before me. and I must cite their work. I must reference their work. If we operate in an institution like that, with what face are we now promoting the adoption of this plagiarism machine? How can we say to our students plagiarism is wrong? And by the way, here's a neat little tool that you can use to plagiarize that is built with plagiarism and that is going to allow you to plagiarize. And why should you use it? Oh, because in your work you will be asked to use it. Yeah, when you graduate, your employer is going to ask to use this tool. So you better, you might as well learn how to use it now. So this has created a fundamental crisis, I think, in academia, in education, not just higher ed, but K through 12, because students are, they're overwhelmed. We're overwhelming them with nonsense homework. We're giving them all of these, assignments that are pointless, busy work. So why wouldn't they use ChatGPT to, deal with their frustration, with their sense of overwhelming? Yes, we're also living in a state. Yeah, we're facing a state of things where a lot of our students are depressed. They're having mental health issues. So maybe this is a way to kind of like, get a little bit of a break instead of having to struggle for a couple of hours. Like, give your prompt to ChatGPT and the assignment is done. So I understand where students come from and I understand their frustration, but I do firmly believe that ChatGPT is corrupting its, their ethical sense of what plagiarism is, and it's also ruining their abilities to think critically, to exercise critical thinking. And we're starting to see research, empirical research that points to this, that the use of these tools basically ruin your ability to think.
Yeah. Yeah, and that's adding on to like a series of changes in the education system that the desire for both surveillance of the instructor and the students, quantifiable measures of progress, and universities wanting to get around having people buy whole books, right? Like if you just think of, I mean, I haven't taught that long, but the amount of reading, the number of pages written that you can assign for the very same class 10 years ago has dropped dramatically. The expectation that the instructor should give free versions of textbooks that
Mm.
your peers or perhaps the professor himself wrote um,
Yes.
is there. It is a and then well, what kind of assignments? Well, we want these ones that are repeatable, that are quote objective, which is one thing if I'm teaching philosophy of science. It's another if it's Heidegger. I don't know what a objective of assessment of whether they followed the preface of Being in Time is, because I don't know if I have yet. And so but there are all these shifts while the vision of education and it's kind of the narrative of legitimation to the public is increasingly pointed towards economic output, that your earning potential and these kinds of things. So you get the focus on STEM and the relegation of the humanities. You get departments in the humanities closing and all these kinds of things. And so it seems as if the incentive structures at the university administration and instructor level, along with the students and their parents and their future workers, have kind of all come together to legitimate all sorts of things that sabotage the formation of a self-reflective modern subject who theoretically we hope becomes a virtuous citizen, family member, neighbor, worker, and these kinds of things. And so I wonder if you see this is kind of one more layer of the kind of the undermining of citizen formation and the undermining of the kind of discourses and community spaces for asking questions of value or cultivating solidarity around the good or the just. Because the moment the educational community isn't grounded in its kind of historic larger vision and becomes subservient to grants, to STEM, to economic outcomes and such, while recruiting students by not because the classes are hard, thoughtful, informing, but because of the perks of being there, entertainment, and all these kinds of things. It seems that this is just one more moment in a longer history of undermining the health of a community because its subjects have learned to engage, discourse, reflect, and think across all the diversity that's present within it.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I think you're exactly right. I mean, firstly, you're right that this has been a long time coming, right? I mean, we can bemoan sort of what's happening today with cheating crisis, with ChatGPT, but these changes, have been are the result of long trends, the corporatization of education, right? Teaching for the test, the quantification of education, and yes, it's amazing now, if we look at our university campuses and just how much of surveillance machines they become, where data about what students do and what faculty do is tracked continuously. I mean, just think about a learning management system, right? Which is like, well, we use it to teach our courses, but um, these are systems provided by third parties, and so they are data territories as well, right? As we were talking about. They are constructed so that data can be extracted and then resold or analyzed for somebody else's benefit. So, what happens in the classroom, what happens through the recruitment process, what happens through the university services, for instance, mental health services, which now, some schools are exploring maybe providing mental health services through AI chatbots to students. All of these things, again, form a data territory where our data is constantly being captured, not just for the benefit of the university, but for other, for the benefit of other players beyond it. I think, in my opinion, what we have is some sort of educational apartheid because I don't think, hopefully, discussions about Heidegger are going to go away. Maybe we will not get to assign the whole book. Maybe you're right. We get to find smaller and smaller chapters and excerpts from them. But I hope there will always be a space in the university to talk about those things. My concern is that more and more that's going to become the domain of rich universities and of rich students. They get to have the actual philosophical discussion with a professor that was trained in the classics, at a prestigious university. And so they will continue to have that experience. The rest of us, the rest of the students will get online learning, surveillance, programs that are defined by corporations. The syllabus is defined by corporations because at the end of the day, we're told what's important is to prepare students for jobs. So if your curriculum is provided by McDonald's or Google, then that's just the way it is because we want people that are able to contribute to these bottom lines of these corporations. So that's my concern that we're going to see that. I mean, we're already seeing it, right? That divide. But my concern is that it's going to get worse. Not that this is a silver lining at all, but I think, again, what's happening today with Doge and with everything, in some ways, it's really disrupting the system because now it turns out even research fund institutions are fearing for their lives. Even they are having their research funds cut. So they are also having to confront these issues that, well, what's going to happen when all of the NSF and NIH and NEH money goes away? So I think we're in for a world of hurt, but hopefully this will also open up opportunities for solidarity so that, big rich universities realize that to some extent, they're in the same boat. And so we all need to do something about
Yeah, one of the things I was having a conversation with my oldest who's doing kind of like half day college, half day high school, and had his first college English paper, and he gave me the rough draft edit, which I was like, so tell me how you want me to edit this. Am I doing like do you want me in professor mode? Like, and then he talked after it. I mean, he got a good grade and things and was talking after it about some of the other people in the class that just used AI to do the whole thing,
it.
and how it was so irritating to him that he spent all this time doing it. And he said, "Well, they're none of their parents are professors, so maybe it kind of did the kind of help that I got after I did a rough draft." And he's like, "But of course, the rough draft took me quite a bit of time over a couple weeks, and they did the whole thing the night before." Um,
Yeah.
and so it got in this conversation of both like doing the grades to get into the university you want and thing. They're like, what marks are they going to look at, right? And so there's this competition of the grade where who uses AI and under what circumstances and what ways is there, and then there's but I want to learn it myself. Like I want to write this, I want you to edit it, but he hangs out with parents that thought this was one of the greatest things they had in their life was this education, and why would you want to ruin it, right?
Right.
And so to me, there seems to be this for him, I got that if he didn't have parents that could help, that is a
Right.
tool to use to get feedback on a rough draft that could be helpful and this kind of thing. And he thought he saw it in his peers, but it completely changes, like you talk about in the article, like what even assessment looks like, and
Yes.
then what does success in that context look like, both like alternative assessment methods that you talk about, and then like at the larger place within the university, like what are steps universities can take to implement things where you have transparency around use or not use. Or I don't know how many of your friends, when you mentioned an AI free class, were like, can I volunteer to do the AI free seminar?
Yeah. Yeah. I
But
think more and more of us are, or at least half,
mhm.
so I think there's a lot of push to adopt these tools and to embrace them. But there's people who are saying, no, not me. This is going to be an AI free space. In my more cynical days, and actually well before ChatGPT, I used to say that yes, with AI, students will pretend to learn, professors will pretend to teach, and then the AI systems will just talk to each other and send a diploma when all the coursework is done, and we can all sit at home. But one of
But
the
if your grading is the first time anyone's read the whole paper, it's really depressing.
it is, but it's also getting better. It's getting more and more difficult, and there's tutorials on TikTok on how to cheat. Be smart about how you cheat with AI because you're not supposed to just take what it generates and submit it. Change a couple of words here and there, run it through the AI, and tell it, okay, now make it sound. Here's an essay I wrote in my own voice. Make it sound like that. So you have to be smart about teaching about cheating with AI. But one of the most interesting studies I heard about, I think this is out of MIT, where they conducted the study. They separated the class into two groups. Some could work with AI, some without. And they gave them the same programming task. It's like, okay, write this program. And both of groups managed to successfully complete it. So, the ones that used AI, of course, they were able to complete it no problems and maybe make some modifications. The interesting fact was that afterwards, let's say a week after that exercise, if you ask students to refer back and explain what they did, only the ones that didn't use AI could do that because they remember, okay, yes, I had to create this program. This is what I did. So I approached it. The ones that used AI were able to complete the assignment, but had no memory, no understanding of the skills that were applied in order to do that. So, yes, AI is useful. It can get the job done, it can make our jobs easier. But that's what I meant earlier that, it's also going to seriously damage our ability to think critically or to think on our own because, we will become good prompt engineers. But that's not the same thing as becoming an educated person, uh, someone who can apply ethics, someone who can, engage in that discussion of what's good for society.
Yeah. The other op-ed that you had shared with me is looking at how this kind of how big tech is ultimately empowering Trump's immigration crackdown, and you talk about how it is enabling a host of kind of anti-immigrant rhetoric and policies. And the nature of how kind of data colonialism is already working in a kind of post-truth, post-literacy world. So, like before, can you kind of talk about just the ways in which our kind of current relationship with technology is already framing a conversation around immigration before you even get to the material reality of those who are implementing a policy and are affected by it?
Well, I thought it was very interesting that just before Trump's inauguration, Mark Zuckerberg announced certain changes to their content moderation policies, where it was actually acceptable. It is now possible and acceptable to say certain things on Instagram or on Facebook, like immigrants are pieces of shit. You can bleep that if you need to in your podcast. But that's actually an example that was given, that was provided as something that now you are allowed to say on Facebook or Instagram that previously would have been monitored, censored, flagged, etc. And so I started this op-ed by saying, that it's kind of interesting that these changes were made just before Trump initiated a campaign very much against immigration. So in order to normalize it, in order to justify it, I thought it was very important that these technology companies, and again, the people who control the data have a lot of power. And so if you're controlling the way in which discourse operates, if you're controlling what you can say on certain platforms, that comes with a lot of power. Because if the immigration policy says, immigrants are rapists, we need to go after them and we need to deport them. And so if on social media people can, express this kind of negative sentiments, then I think they are thinking it's going to be okay. This justifies, rationalizes it. So it is not accidental at all, I think, that at the inauguration, we saw all the CEOs of the major tech companies that are sitting in the audience, right? They know that it's not only about being nice to whoever is in power, because obviously that has always happened. But I think, there's also a certain kind of ideological alignment that unfortunately, if we start to look, and there's been a lot of research in this, if we start to look at the kind of things that CEOs in Silicon Valley believe, they're not that misaligned with what Trump and JD Vance and Project 2025 or whatever believe. So it's a view of the world where, to go back to our initial point, it's a very colonial view of the world. Certain people should have all of the power. We should trust these people because they represent modernity, they represent progress, they represent salvation, and they should have all of the power to, take resources that don't belong to them and appropriate them and use them to, change the way we live, change the way we work, change the way we socialize and love. So I think when it comes to border control, as I said earlier, it's becoming increasingly a datafied operation. Control of the borders translates into control of data. There's a massive surveillance apparatus in place to monitor border crossings, to keep track of everybody so that, whether your status, whether you represent someone we want to let in, we want to let someone cross a border or not, prevent them from crossing a border. The data that we have on this person will allow us to make certain kinds of decisions about them. So maybe it has to do with legal status, but maybe it
Hmm.
also has to do with gender identity. Maybe it also has to do with whether you search for information on abortion. Maybe it has to do with your religion. So data is power when it comes to wanting to keep people in and keep others out. And that's a very colonial exercise,
Hmm.
you know, um, keeping undesirable peoples outside of the colonized gated community has been the modus operandi of colonizing powers. It is not an accident that fingerprinting was a technology invented in colonial India and then imported back to the center of empire and to the rest of the world. But surveillance technologies are colonial technologies because, again, it's very important to control the flow of people. So, and of course, in order to do that, you need technology, you need information, you need data. So, my argument I make in this op-ed is that big tech will be a central player in all of this. Now, I should point out one last thing that it does seem that the current government is overreaching a little. I think a lot of what is happening right now, it's mostly for uh, shaping public opinion, for feeding conspiracy theories. But I was hearing that, for instance, the number of deportations is going down. I think the government is trying to do too much with too little resources and without really an agenda other than an agenda of hate and exclusion. So I did hear that deportations at the moment, who knows, this could change tomorrow, they're actually at lower levels than under Biden. So I think they have overreached a little bit, and not even all of the technology in the world, at the end of the day, will make a project based on death and oppression and exclusion and hate palatable and sustainable over the long term. So I'm still hopeful that just by the weight of all of this hatred and bias, a lot of the system will collapse onto itself. But we need to play a part, obviously, as well, because it's not going to happen magically. And a lot of
Hmm.
damage is being done.
Yeah, the ways in which kind of technology and data collection play a role, kind of technology and data collection play immigration policy, incarceration to e-carceration technologies.
I didn't come
Um,
up with that, by the way. Yeah.
what I had never read it till,
Okay.
and
But it's true, yes. How it's becoming possible to monitor people. You don't need to put them in a jail. You can give them an ankle bracelet or even through their phone, keep track of them wherever they go. Yeah.
there's the kind of intense versions of something that of this agenda that kind of is really kind of like snowballing from sticking a bunch of tech billionaires behind the president when he's inaugurated, and oh well, let's hand Elon Musk, who's kind of like fourth place right now in collections of data for AI in America, let's hand him the keys to all sorts of data no one's ever seen before, and see if he benefits from it or uses it, for the well-being of the country. And like there are these kinds of things that are happening now, but there is a larger bipartisan consensus around the logic of neoliberalism and the kind of liberatory principles, that could be seen in technology. And one of the things the kind of data colonialism framework does is problematizes kind of the value neutral sense of these technologies. And so I wonder for people who want to advocate for policy changes or kind of like shifts in direction, how has kind of attention to this kind of digital infrastructure of our current kind of colonialism shaped the way you orient thinking about both activism or the cultivating of solidarity and resistance that takes seriously the larger framework?
Yeah. Well, one of the reasons why I accepted your invitation trip is because, I read about your interest in liberation theology and the interest in this community surrounding that that topic. I grew up in Latin America, and liberation theology has always been kind of a great reference point, especially in the sense that, of course, we know that the church did horrible things, was participant in the project of colonialism too. But and it was part of this extractivist system and a system of oppression. All of that is true. But to me, liberation theology represents a moment when a certain critique from within was possible and a certain form of resistance and change was possible from within, not necessarily throwing the baby out with the bathwater, perhaps, in fact, going back to the fundamentals of the religion, the stuff that promotes, humanity and solidarity. So I think changes like that or movements like that are very important. Now, when Nick and I talk about how to resist the data colonialism, we actually look at what the activists in Latin America have been doing for a long time, because there are people who have long histories of resisting colonialism, and we can learn from them. And what they tell us is that we must work across three different levels. We must work within the system, against the system, and beyond the system. Just focusing in one of those areas is not going to be enough. So we need to think across all three. And thinking within the system is a little bit what you were mentioning, perhaps liberation theology, perhaps putting pressure on governments to pass certain kinds of policies that benefit us, that don't benefit primarily corporations. We need to keep doing that. And I know right now with what's happening in our government, that's kind of depressing and everyone wants to run away. But we will need to keep working in this area of working within the system to try to change the system from within. Corporate dissent is another great area. And we have lots of brave, courageous voices within corporations and within the government who are standing up and saying, this is not okay. People are quitting Doge. People are having protests within Microsoft and Google saying, what the way in which you are collaborating, for instance, with armies around the world, including in Israel, and committing acts of oppression against Gaza. We're not okay with that. We're not okay with participating in the construction of these technologies. So working within the system is going to be crucial. But of course, the systems are going to magically fix itself one of these days. So working against it is very important. And to all forms of protests, all forms of resisting the system. And again, here we can learn a lot from the colonial movements, from those movements that have decades of experience of resisting. Their struggles might be very different from our struggles. Sometimes we are part of their problem because we're standing on occupied land that we stole from them, but we can still learn from them, can still engage them in dialogue to learn how to resist colonialism. And I think the last level of working beyond the system is also crucial because whether you're working within or against the system, you're still being defined by the system. So working beyond it, imagining alternatives, using imagination to come up with solutions that no one has thought of before, using creativity to come up with different kinds of tools. I think that's going to be essential in decolonizing basically our lives, in decolonizing space and time and love. We're going to have to do all of that. So I'm hopeful that we are all contributing to this cultural movement, like liberation theology was a movement where we can at least imagine uh, what a different world could look like. Um, Colonialism is very absolutist system. It's very difficult to imagine alternatives because once the mind is colonized, it's like we even forget what things used to be like. We lose the capacity to imagine alternatives, but that never goes away. So I think imagination, thinking beyond the system, can help us come up with this system to participate in the decolonization of data, but also just the decolonization of the world, undoing the legacy of colonialism, which is still very much with us today.
Yeah, I really appreciate that. That to me, it reminds me of John Sobrino, liberation theologian from El Salvador, who talked about how difficult it is for people to understand or conceptualize fidelity to the God of the underside if we haven't gotten rid of our idols. And so he has this essay where he talks about you don't recognize idols in the abstract or just get there by reason. You go to the sites in which the idols have demanded sacrifice because they always have. And then there, right, when you recognize the crucified people or the people that are being sacrificed or creation, that it's in solidarity in those spaces that one can begin to speak the word of God, to describe God, that ultimately doesn't become some kind of rhetorical legitimation of a domination system. And like in many ways, those early generations of liberation theology problematized the kind of self-assured narrative a lot of kind of European and Anglo-American visions of religion had, especially that was reified in the Cold War context. But when we start to think about the kind of challenges we face now, I think that you and Nick's work on a digital kind of form of colonialism and the way data creates these territories that occupy the subjectivities of people and orient our material realities in ways we never really consented to. And it's diminishing the flourishing of life across the planet in so many ways, and really making our horizon towards the future to seem increasingly apocalyptic. Like at some point, the idolatry of the legitimation structure of this system needs to become transparent. But if we don't understand what we're up against, then even the best intentioned or most beautiful articulations of the possibilities one could see, right, like in an executed revolutionary being raised into the life of God, even that can be occupied by other forces. And so that's one of the reasons I so deeply appreciated your work, because I think there are people in so many different parts of the globe with different experiences who have had kind of existential encounters with the divine, have found the story of Jesus' own life and solidarity and care and compassion and commitment to justice compelling. And yet, if we don't understand what we're up against, and we don't understand the idols demanding sacrifice in our age, then our best efforts and energy get oriented in the wrong ways. And so that's why I was so energized to discover your work and start to think through it again, because the kind of previous generations of liberation theologians got to know a different context than one where there is a giant data grab of new territory, and all the ways surveillance and algorithms have created a new kind of sovereignty that shape people's subjectivity often before any conscious reflection. And that's a very different kind of context to start to understand just what bondage and oppression look like and what solidarity on the other side of it is. I mean, I even think of how many of the people listening to this and have been, there are a couple thousand people in a class where Jörg Rieger and I talked to 12 different liberation theologians from across the globe, but like almost all of that happened on platforms that are being data mined. And almost all the places you have a community, right, to voice or to gather or to organize is already been in an occupied space. And so when you talk about that third element, the beyond, one of the things, as someone who doesn't have who comes from a very privileged context, one of the things I found so compelling about the liberation movement, be it in Latin and South America, or the Black theology movement and the way it relates to Black power in America, or the Mujerista movement, like all these kinds of things showed a potential for a kind of community solidarity beyond the power structures of the given system. and what enabled it was the kind of solidarity that both recognizes the neighbor and your enemy as the face of God, and the character and nature of the divine revealed in the executed one. And so one of the things I'm hoping, just like the compelling way you described it, is to help people start to imagine what are the potentials there when, a third of the planet says, give us today our daily bread together in a host of different contexts and languages. What happens if that us has a connection and a solidarity that does not have to be limited to the places the platforms give us and the tribes and logic and rhetoric of dismissal or legitimation it incentivizes in the algorithms? Because the world doesn't have to be this way. It didn't have to get this way. And I think that as people kind of awaken to the ways, like this kind of like pre-conscious captivity of our desires and our fears, and the way they're being manipulated and oriented towards the broocracy in Silicon Valley being our saviors, like at some point there's going to be enough people to want to opt out of that. And in that space, I hope the kind of solidarity that we cultivate now becomes the ground of something beautiful and more liberating, and something worth handing off to our kids and our grandchildren. Anyway, sorry, that was just me feeling really nice, because this is why I love getting to read your to read your work.
Yeah. No, I really like what you said. I really appreciate that. And I think it's true. I think, at the end of the day, capitalism and colonialism have very little to offer except death, destruction, inequality. So I agree with you that there's so much richness and so much space left for us to imagine beautiful things. And I think sometimes in history, I think the challenge, each generation faces a different challenge. So it's true. It might seem like today we're facing greater challenge than before. But yeah, I do think it is possible to activate and organize and still, to abandon what's bad about these models and retain what's good about them and reimagine them in more productive and beautiful ways. So I think, yeah, we should and could and can continue to struggle for sure.
Yeah, yeah, and it's fascinating to me how, like, the only binary Jesus worked with is you can serve God or mammon, and then and the church has spent the last 2,000 years figuring out a workaround. It's well, do we really need
Yeah.
that? Because I'd rather legislate body parts.
Right.
But,
Right.
yeah.
I like that.
Well, thank you so much for doing this. Are there other than the op-eds, which I can link, are there other places you'd like for me to point people to connect and follow what you're up to?
Yeah. I have a website, which I will put the link. I'm not extremely active on social media. I do have a Blue Sky, but I don't use it uh, that much. At the end of the day, I'm trying to, I do a lot of email, so I'm not pretending that I'm beyond using these technologies. I carry a smartphone just like everybody else. But at the end of the day, I enjoy just, interacting with people one on one outside of these platforms. But I do post what I'm doing on Blue Sky. So if you want to follow that, you're more than welcome.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much. This has been a blast. Quite an
It
honor.
has been. No, thank you. I really like this. I hope I didn't talk too long. But, anytime you want to invite me back, I'll be happy to have
All
more
right.
conversations.
Sounds wonderful. Thanks.
All right.